Hello and welcome to the Emotion at Work podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human condition. And today's topic is going to be one that we're going to be discussing over 3 special edition episodes. And it's something that we talked about on the podcast before. So we talked about it in the past with Amanda Arrowsmith, and then most recently on episode 50, where we talked about imposter phenomenon. And my guest today is fascinated by the topic and has got some really, really interesting practical tips and ideas to share. And that's why I think it's really important that we have this episode, because it's what my guest and I are going to talk about is both exploring what imposter phenomenon is and also looking at it from a particular lens with also, like I said, that practical element alongside it as well. So let's get our guest on the air. So I'd love to welcome to the Emotion at Work podcast, Hanne Vincent. Hello, Hanne.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Very good. How are you?
Yeah, really well, thank you. Yeah, really well. It's been a long week, and I'm excited to end it with our recording today. So yeah, doing really well, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really excited. I'm really curious doing this with you, and I'm looking forward to the results. And hopefully we can share some interesting facts and tips to the audience. Really looking forward to share it.
Good. Yeah, me too. And I think that practical element, I think, is going to be really helpful. So when you sent across to me your original sort of document, the thinking that you sent across, I thought I'd really like how practical it is. So I'm really excited about that side of things. Now, before we get there, though, as always with the Emotion of Work podcast, we need to open with our unexpected yet innocuous question. So my unexpected yet innocuous question for you then, Hanne, is what flower or flowers have meaning for you?
Oh, interesting one. There's quite a lot of them, and my native language is not English, so I'll have to pick one that I know the word in English. Let's see. I think it's probably how do you call them? I don't even know how to call them. I need to Google it. It's those little white and yellow flowers that are all over the grass in spring, where young girls make little necklaces of them and little crowns.
Okay. So I would call them daisies. I would call them daisies.
Daisy. That's probably right. Yes, so daisies. That's probably a flower that brings me a lot of joy when I start seeing them pop up. And it really reminds me of just being a little girl and making necklaces and putting them in my hair, and it evokes a lot of warm memories, let's say. So yeah, that daisies, and thank you for the word.
Oh, you're welcome. And so what would it be in your native tongue?
Madelifius.
Madelifius.
Excellent.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Wonderful.
You're a natural. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I now know what daisy is. So that's good. No, that's wonderful. That's fabulous.
Yeah, and so same for me. I needed a bit of a reminder, but yeah. So I lived in the UK for 3 years. I consider my English to be fairly well, but these kind of specific words are always a challenge. I'll do my best on this podcast, but it might be at some point I will be hesitating and searching for words sometimes, so bear with me.
Oh, that's absolutely fine. And that's the joy of show notes as well. So what I'll make sure we do in the notes that accompany the show is we'll put the translations in as well. So we'll make sure we put the Madelifius. Is that right?
Yeah, Madelifius. Yeah. So you'll go and say, here's what she actually was trying to say.
Yeah. Definitely. So I think for me, it's the tulip. And if I'm honest, I've probably stolen that from my wife. I was never really into flowers when I was younger. I did used to make daisy chains, but I would normally make daisy chains for a girl that I liked at the time. So I'd make the daisy chain as like a gift or a way to strike up a conversation. But yeah, I love.
How successful was that?
Mixed results, I would say.
Mixed
Yeah,
results.
mixed results. So sometimes I'd try and rush it and then make it too small, and then it was like I didn't put enough effort into make it long enough to fit around the wrist or around the neck,
Yeah. Or they'd
or
break
they
just at
break.
a crucial
Yeah,
moment.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um,
Very recognizable.
and also, the more often you do it, the more the girls realise that it wasn't something that was unique and special to them.
Oh,
So, oh yeah, that
you went you went
yeah
you went too
went too
far.
far. Yeah, that's
You didn't keep.
Phil's done his
Mm,
trick again. Yeah, that one.
yeah.
Yeah.
Get it.
But yeah, I love tulips. We've got quite a lot of them in the garden. So similar to what you were saying earlier on, that kind of significance of spring, and the tulips coming up and the bulbs growing is lovely.
Yeah, tulips are beautiful as well.
Mm,
Love them.
yeah, definitely. Um, okay, so when we first sort of contacted each other, I guess, or we first spoke, then you sent me your book called The Masked Employee. Um, and I was really interested in that title for a couple of different reasons. So one, as regular listeners of the podcast will know, I've talked about the idea of sort of face work and impression management and behavioral masks in the past. I was particularly interested in it, and it was, and then when I read it and to work out it was much more about imposter phenomenon. Again, I was interested in both the metaphor and the subject itself. So what kind of got you interested in imposter phenomenon and all this notion of masking?
So the book is indeed about the imposter phenomenon, but it's specifically about as a manager. So it's really mostly from the perspective of the manager, and how to get the best out of people struggling with imposter feelings.
Mm.
And it's a subject that has been breeding in my head for quite a while. I work as a freelance consultant now since over 5 years, but before that I was working in a big multinational company,
Mm-hmm.
climbing the promotional ladder and changing roles every 2 or 3 years. And at one point I had quite a large team, and we were the business unit I was working in was being sold, and we were going through this fusion with another company,
Mm.
and it was lots of changes, and the team really depended on me. And I mean, it was going well. I was doing well, getting lots of positive feedback, and both from the team, from my boss. So on the outside there was nothing wrong, but what no one saw was that inside I was terrified constantly of being discovered, of being found out that I was no good at managing this, and I was
Mm.
definitely not the right person. I was and so that really drained my energy. I wasn't sleeping well. I really felt like I was constantly putting up a show, and that's
Mm-hmm.
really, really exhausting. And so at one point, I actually decided to hand in my resignation. That's about 5 years now. And the official version was, distance, because part of the fusion was that we had to move offices. So that was my official reason.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, the real reason was just the burden of this mask, the weight of having to carry this mask. Was just too heavy for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something I never admitted to my colleagues at that time. But after that, I did a lot of self-reflection, and I was really trying to understand where this feeling's coming from. I knew about imposter phenomenon
Mm-hmm.
at that moment, so and I read a lot about it. And one of the things that I read, and that really surprised me, is how widespread this feeling is, how many people struggle with this. And so I started wondering why. I worked for so long in big multinational companies that praise themselves with having really, really great leadership courses, personal development courses. And I just wondered, why did I never hear of this if so many people struggle with it?
Mm-hmm.
And I also wondered, what if I had been approached differently? What if my manager had awareness about the topic, had knowledge on how to approach it? I'm sure that I I'm pretty sure I would still be there. And by all means, I love my life as it is. I love the choices I've made. I'm very happy. So I really don't want to come across as a victim. But it is something that I started wondering. Like, I don't think it's so difficult to make an impact as a manager. But there's very little that is written about it. If you go on the internet, it's all about self-help. It's all about tips and tricks, how to overcome your own feelings and struggles, which is useful, or sometimes useful, sometimes not so much. But very rarely is it about, as a manager, probably, several of your team members struggle with it. What do you do? And so that's how I got into writing this little book, which isn't actually a book. It's more like a script or something for an audio book that I'm working on. But yeah, so that's how I got into it.
Okay. And I want to make sure we come back and we focus on what you were referring to there about. I wonder how it might have been different if my manager had known about it, and if my manager had maybe been able to help me, and that would bring us back to the practical suggestions and things. Before I do that, though, would it be okay if I ask you just a couple more questions about your experience of it? Would that be okay?
Absolutely, yeah.
So you mentioned that it was the weight of the mask that kind of got you to that point where you said, you know what, I can't do it anymore. I'm going to hand in my resignation. Did that mask get heavier over time, or was it just that you've been holding that weight for so long you just couldn't hold it anymore? If I stick with the metaphor.
I think for me, the mask was heaviest at the beginning of my career. And I'll get to that a bit later. But I think in general, over time, it gets better with experience, with time, with knowledge of what you're able to do, what your capabilities are. But it also peaks at certain moments, and it peaks at moments of transition, when you enter a new role, when you start leading a new team. Those are typically when the weight of the mask gets really heavy. And it also really depends on who is your manager at that time, and if it's something you're able to discuss with them, if you're able to show your struggles, or if you have to carry that on your own. And that for me was also a big one, because I didn't have that at that moment, and it just was. I panicked. It was a fight or flight reaction. And again, it was a good choice at that moment for me. I don't regret it, but I think it could have gone differently, very differently.
Okay. And you also mentioned earlier on that it was widespread. So are there any estimates in terms of, kind of,
yeah. If the number that often comes back is 70%. So it's estimated that about 70% of the people at one point will experience these fraudulent feelings, which is huge. I mean, 70%. That means that lots of people around you feel it, and if you're not feeling it, at least many of your colleagues do. But of course, what I want to emphasize is that not all 70% will experience this as problematic in the long term. And I would even say it's perfectly normal to from time to time have these feelings. It's even maybe healthy, because it allows it nudges you into self-reflection. It shows that you're capable of being self-critical, of trying to work on yourself. So It's not at all a negative thing. It's maybe even the opposite of arrogance. But of course, if this is an issue in the long term, like it was with me, and if these thoughts are actually impacting your performance and your well-being at work, and if they do so over a long period of time, months, years, then it becomes problematic, and it can lead to all kinds of. In my case, I just throw in the dice, or how do you call it in English? I gave up. I handed in my resignation, but it could lead to burnout. It could lead to depression, anxiety, etc. So 70% is the number, but not all of those 70%. Of course, we'll see it as something that's problematic.
And I think the point you made earlier on about how a change in context or a change in situation or differences in situations may make those feelings more or less intense, or they may last for more or less time. So you described about how taking on a new role or taking on a new responsibility or maybe a promotion or moving into a new business or a new part of the organization, those occasions can be when the feelings can be stronger. And I think that's where Clance and Susanne Imes kind of try and make the distinction between, and I don't think we've used the words imposter syndrome yet, which is what's often used. They very much advocate for the use of a phenomenon instead, because it can fluctuate and change over time. So whilst you might feel it for one section of time, whether that could be a few minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, it may then pass and not appear again for.
Here's what I found.
Oh, sorry, my watch managed to hear me then, so I'll try that one again. Clance and Imes then talked about how it's more of a phenomenon than it is a syndrome. Because of those. Definitely.
It sounds a bit medical. It sounds a bit like a disease if you say the syndrome, and it's more like. It's described as and I quite like that description as a form of intellectual self-doubt, where your inner critic prevents you to believe in the qualities and the achievements that other people attribute to you or associate you with, and so the result is that you constantly have the feeling that you're pretending, really. So that's where the mask comes from. You're constantly feeling like you're wearing a mask and you're pretending to be that person that they think you are, which is exhausting.
And I'm happy for you to interpret this question either as a question for you for your experience and or from what the research says in terms of imposter phenomenon. So what happens sort of for an individual? What are they thinking, or what are the stories that they're kind of hearing in their head when that imposter phenomenon is there?
Yeah, I see it, and the way I described in the book is, I think there's primarily two thought mechanisms or thought reflexes that happen inside the brain or the mind of the imposter. I say the imposter, you know what I mean. It's just because person struggling with imposter feelings is a bit long. So and those two thought mechanisms, I call them the shield and the sponge. And if we start with the shield, and I'll give some personal examples as well. The shield is basically a mechanism that deflects any recognition or success that is attributed to the person, and makes it very difficult to accept and absorb really any positive feedback or personal achievements or success. And so what they'll do is when these praises or recognitions, when it comes their way, they'll be very quick to push them aside and write them off as due to external factors, like it was just good luck, or I was just lucky with the timing, or this colleague actually contributed just as much, or it could be all kinds of excuses. But it's very difficult for most employees to absorb or internalize the praise that they're given, and even worse, because they don't feel like they deserve the praise or the award or the promotion even. These kind of recognitions may even end up worsening their imposter feelings, because they just consider them to be the results of their efforts of keeping up appearances. And it just adds to the pile of the evidence that will, come to light when they are finally unmasked or finally discovered. And I really I read a quote of Emma Watson, who described just that. She said, she said at one point, it's almost like the better I do, the more my feeling of inadequacy increases, because at one point somebody's going to find out that I'm a total fraud and I don't deserve any of what I've achieved. And that's, said by Emma Watson, who's a great actress. And I think there was another actress who won an Oscar, and she said, winning an Oscar actually made my imposter feelings worse. So it's this really twisted thought process that is often very difficult to understand for people who never experience this. Like, how can you feel like this? How can you feel like a fraud when you've achieved so much? And for me, this shield has always been very powerful. And I'll give you an example. At one point, we had these award and recognition sessions when there was like a big international sales meeting, and it was moments where, at the end of the meeting they would call people to the stage and hand them out an award for an achievement or something. And at one point those moments were just nerve-wracking for me, because exposure means a risk of being discovered. As an imposter, you always want to stay under the radar, because they might find out if you actually get any attention. And so at one point, my name was called out. So worst case scenario, I had to go on the stage and accept an award. And I can still remember vividly, by the time I'd gotten off the stage and my colleagues came to me to congratulate me, I had my defense mechanism basically had kicked in, and I had come up with a whole story of, it's not actually about my achievement. I was just, politically the least sensitive person to get the award, because this one would have made it politically awkward, and that other person couldn't have been it. So they had to choose me. I mean, I constructed this whole narrative about, why the award came to me instead of just saying thank you, I appreciate it. That it's just a very powerful reflex. And if I can give another example, when I was leading, I stepped into a role of team leader at one point. I was leading a team that wasn't in a great shape. The previous manager wasn't very appreciated. There was a bad atmosphere. There wasn't a lot of trust. People didn't feel they were treated fairly, didn't feel that they were granted the opportunities that they should be granted. So it was just a deflated, not very agreeable team atmosphere. And so I made it as one of my priorities to fix this. And so I spent a lot of time talking to all the individuals, going out to lunch with them, talking about, their expectations, how they wanted to be treated. I changed the team meetings, did some team building, blah, blah, blah. So I worked really hard. And then at one point, I think about 6 months after I stepped into the role, there was this employee survey that went out every year where engagement was measured, so that they would measure the engagement towards the company, towards the team, towards the manager. And the results came back, and they were actually really strong, a huge increase versus the previous year. And my first reaction, which I can still feel even, was just sheer panic, because needed to get out of there before the next survey would launch the next year, because by then they would have figured me out and I would have terrible scores, and I needed to get away. Which is a strange reaction, right? If you think about it, but that's how powerful this shield is. And by then I knew about the imposter phenomenon, and so you would think, I recognize it, check, first step, but it doesn't mean that because you know it doesn't make you feel different. So that's still another step in your self-management. But yeah, just to show this shield is a really powerful reflex, I'd say.
And I really like the framing of both the shield and the sponge as a reflex. I think that's a lovely way to frame it.
Yeah, it's unintentional. That's why I like to call it a reflex. It's just something that happens instantly, without you having any control over it, really.
Okay. So if that's the shield, tell me about the sponge then. So what's the sponge reflex?
Yeah. So the sponge is the opposite. Actually, the sponge is constantly on the lookout for proof of your incapability or your inability, or the proof that you're not right for the job. So while they will link their accomplishments and their successes to chance, they'll, on the contrary, take on all the blame for any failures or even minor errors, and they will take it as a proof of their lack of intelligence or skill or something. I consider myself an absolute pro in this area, very good at it, magnifying small mistakes, and turning even a well-meant constructive feedback into undeniable proof that I shouldn't be there. And that was especially true at the start of my career, and the slightest hiccup would leave me completely paralyzed. Where I saw my more confident colleagues, because I started in sales, so you have the typical sales profile, which attracts more confident people than average, and I'd look at them and they would just brush off mistakes and say, oh, it's no big deal, or everybody makes mistakes, or even blame someone else. And I would just look at them, how do they manage to do that? That was something that for me was really hard to understand. Yeah, it's typical for imposters to overestimate and overvalue the qualities of their peers and feel threatened by it. And that's actually one of the things that for me I really regret, because it hampers your growth. It shuts you down for growth, and it sabotages any open to learn mentality that you should have to start developing. And one of the examples to illustrate that is, we had at my company, we had this often even international we call it share and reapply sessions, where people showcase a case or show an achievement, and the objective really is learning, so that you learn from one another, so nobody reinvents the wheel, and it's supposed to be inspiring, and it's supposed to make you want to learn and grow. And for me, these sessions were just absolutely daunting, because they just every case that one of my peers would present in another country or within my team would just show me that I wasn't capable of doing that, even if I had cases myself. But it was just every time this looking up and feeling small that is really paralyzing, and seeing proof of your inability everywhere, which is just a self-sabotaging mechanism and reflex that really needs a lot of experience to grow out.
And no, sorry, I was thinking. Sorry, my apologies, Hannah. I was thinking. So I was trying to take in everything that I said. I was taking in everything that you said and thinking, wow. Um, and I suppose if I then, so I was thinking, wow, because because of the vividness with which you described it, and I could feel the feelings that you were describing as you were describing it because it was so vivid. Um,
Okay.
and I think, and I was then putting myself in the in my sort of putting myself back in time when I was a manager, and thinking, would I have been equipped? So would I have been equipped to to help someone who was feeling
Mm,
those feelings, if that makes sense?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because I could
Yeah.
imagine as the manager, I might also think, you know what, I'd just rather Hannah just sorted that stuff out for herself. Thanks, that'd be just a lot easier. Because then I wouldn't I wouldn't have to worry about it. So what is it that
Yeah.
what are we advocating for here to say why managers should be interested in this and why this is something that they should care about?
Mm. Yeah, yeah, very good question because it could be, yeah, why should I fix this? And absolutely, I'm a huge advocate for self-management. It's important to work on yourself. Um, but um, I'll give you a couple of reasons why it's also in the best interest of the manager to be
Mhm.
involved. Um, First of all, I think research has shown that people suffering with imposter feelings are often very intelligent, high achieving, and very conscientious employees that set the bar very high for themselves. So I think they're definitely very valuable to the organization. They're the typical so-called insecure
Mhm.
overachievers. So they are very valuable, and so getting them the maximum out of them will definitely benefit the business and the organization. Um, but second, also, is that imposter thoughts can result in behavior that is actually hampering a successful business outcome. So, for example, a very typical type of behavior is holding back. I've already mentioned it,
Yeah.
flying under the radar, not speaking up during meetings. They're constantly censoring their own thoughts during a meeting because they just don't believe that their ideas or their remarks can be valuable, or it might even be completely off the mark. And imagine that, because that would definitely expose them, as being a fraud. So as a manager, you're potentially missing out on some valuable input, and preventing you from making the best decisions. So that's one example, but also, like I said it earlier, they might go in the anxiety or the stress might drive them into burnout or depression, which is the disease of our time, which immediately affects you as a manager. And I think I'm really convinced that by doing just a couple of things differently, and it doesn't take a lot of effort, could just make a huge difference for the person you're managing. And that's why I'm trying to get this out, because I knew, for me at least, it would have made a huge difference with not a whole lot of effort, I believe.
So I mentioned in the intro that this is the first of three different episodes all around imposter phenomenon. So as we start to bring this first episode, I guess, towards a close, we've talked about what the phenomenon is. We've talked about how widespread it might be. We've talked about what might be happening in somebody's mind, and you've given those great examples of those reflexes of the shield and the sponge. We've explored what the reasons for why managers would be interested or bothered by it. But I suppose what would also help if I was a manager then would be to think about, well, if I wanted to unlock the potential of imposters in my team, the first thing I'd need to do would be to identify those people that might be struggling with it. So is there something
Hmm.
practical about how I could do that? How could I recognize those people that might be struggling with imposter phenomenon?
Yeah. That's actually a very important first step, and not necessarily the easiest one. Simply because research has shown that when people are asked to describe these imposter feelings, it's mostly expressed as feelings of shame. And obviously, when people feel ashamed, the most common reaction is going to be to not talk about it, and hide it. So I think it's fair to say they won't come knocking on your door saying, "Hey, I've got these feelings. Can you please help me?" And quite the contrary. So they're usually very good at hiding their feelings. When I had handed in my resignation, and I talked to a couple of colleagues afterwards, and I confessed to them that I had these fraudulent feelings and how they had really clouded my confidence in my career. Their reaction was, they were really surprised, and they said, how is this possible when you always seem so calm and composed? Now, I can tell you, calm and composed was the opposite of what was going in my mind at that time. So yes, a lot of people are very good at hiding it. So when it comes to identifying them in our team, you might need to dig a bit deeper and look a bit further than just a facade. But there are a couple of predictors or cues that could help you place the right people on your radar. And there's in particular three predictors, I would say, that could be useful. First is there's a couple of high incidence groups, just groups where that proportionally have a high number of imposters in them. Secondly, we could look at language and what's typical choice of words that they might use. And then third, we've briefly touched upon it, is what type of behaviors could help you recognize them. Okay. So if we look at high incidence groups, the first one is a little bit controversial. Not everybody agrees, but it's women. I don't know if you've seen the Barbie film recently.
No, I haven't yet. No, so it's on my list to watch, but no, I haven't managed to get to the cinema yet.
Good. But even if you haven't, if you're on any kind of social media, it's all about, how women are approached differently, still how they're dressed differently. And it is still true. We know from research that women are unfortunately still approached differently, even as young girls growing up. They will receive, on average, less compliments. They will be less stimulated to take risk, to express themselves. And there's one woman who's really an expert in the field of imposter phenomenon, which is Dr. Valerie Young. And she says that women are actually more likely, when there's a setback or a failure, they're more likely to blame themselves and blame it on their own actions, while men are more prone to blame outside factors. And another interesting observation is that research shows that on average, men and women have kind of a similar comparable IQ. However, when women are asked how they would assess their own IQ, they assess it on average 10% lower than average, where men assess it about 10% above average. So that shows just how, women are just more prone to having these feelings and are more, in a way, receptive to the voice of their inner critic. But there is some discussion about it, and some research suggests that men experience it equally as much as women. It could also just be that it surfaces more with women because there's more of a stigma with men, and they're afraid of being labeled weak or incompetent. But there are men coming forward. I don't know if you've seen the Lewis Capaldi documentary on Netflix at all.
I have, yeah.
So he talks about it. He talks about imposter feelings, and he even wrote a song about it. I think it's called "I'm a Pretender" something.
Yeah,
nice song. So women is commonly accepted as being a high incidence group. The second one is minority groups. This one is about people both coming from minority backgrounds or people that suffer from a disability, for example, they easily feel like they're an outsider and like they don't belong, and so it makes them very vulnerable to these imposter feelings. But I would like to, in the case of imposter feelings, I think that the concept of minorities can even be interpreted more broadly, broader than just race or gender or sexual orientation. I would argue that actually, from the moment people feel like they're an outsider, there is a higher chance of imposter feelings popping up. And if you're, for example, even if it's just character, if you're the quiet one in a team of very confident, extroverted people, and they all get along really well, and the manager is also very confident and extroverted, and they really fit together, you might easily link this connection to a higher appreciation among each other, and you feel you're not living up to the same standards. So it's whenever you feel like you're a minority, makes you more vulnerable to these feelings. Another, maybe I just wanted to touch also in this context on diversity quota, which is a hot topic in a lot of companies these days, and rightfully so. I'm all for it. But the flip side of that one also, and I've experienced that more than once, is that that the aim to get more women or people of color in senior positions, for example, makes sometimes these people feel that they got the promotion or they were hired just because they're a woman or a gay or a dark-skinned person, and that combined with remarks that other people make, or I don't stand any chance, I'm just a white heterosexual man, often makes them feel like they have to work extra hard to be worthy of it, and it makes them again more vulnerable to these people. So I don't have the answer to it, because I think it's good to have these diversity quota, but there is a flip side to it, definitely.
Yeah, I think that there's I'm a, what's the word I'm looking for? The systemic nature of groups and society and business and individuals, I find absolutely fascinating. And I think what you're talking about there within that first area of high incidence groups is some of the constructive and the destructive aspects of those societal societal systems, or those the systems, for example, the natural, I say the natural, that's not the right phrase, the commonplace competitive nature of organizations, especially if you're looking in more individualistic cultures where it's the performance of the individual as compared with others that succeeds. That system of reward in and of itself, by definition, creates those that have to be excluded, because at some point, if you're going to do a forced distribution, which a lot of organizations will do, some people will be at the top and some people will be at the bottom, because we're forcing a distribution in that way because of the systems that we have in place. And that system in and of itself can emphasize, reinforce, or maybe increase the intensity of imposter feelings, which has got nothing to do with the individual and all to do with the system. And I think organizations and managers forget that, I think. So one thing I talked about in episode 50 was the idea that you as a manager, or you as an owner of a business, or you as a director in a company, may well be creating imposters because of the systems and processes that you have in place. So you might be creating the situations that allow those that feel imposter phenomenon feelings, you might be creating the conditions that allow those feelings to grow. So it's actually not about the individual, and it's not the individual's fault at all. It's actually the fault of the system that you have.
Exactly, you have in place. And in these, and in these cases, you might argue that you don't struggle with imposter feelings. You're made to struggle. You're made to have these imposter feelings because of the environment and all the biases and all the systemic how do you say it? You know what I mean.
I know what you mean. Yeah, the systemic components or
Exactly.
the systemic overlaps.
Yeah.
Because if you that's one of the
Absolutely.
challenges. You put a load of you described a number of different things within that. And you said if you feel like an outsider, that can amplify those imposter feelings, and that feeling like an outsider can be created by the systems and processes that individual managers or organizations as a whole
exactly. And so
put into
it's
place.
really crucial. Yeah, so it's really crucial that managers are aware of their own biases.
Yes.
And that they're aware of the environment and the atmosphere they're creating. And only when they're aware, they will know how they will be open to realizing how this impacts the people in their team. But this awareness of bias is often a challenge. But that's something that organizations should really work on. That's not something you as an individual can change.
And I think
can influence.
Absolutely, and I think that's a big reason why I wanted to get you on the podcast, because I think what can a podcast do? Can a podcast change an organization or change a company or change a 50, 60-year-old reward and recognition system? No, it probably can't. What can a podcast do? It can support small change in terms of supporting a manager, for example, who's thinking, yeah, you know what, I might have somebody in my team that experiences these feelings, and how can I help them? And so that's why when you sent your thinking and your writing through, I really wanted to get you on as a guest. So,
well, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for coming on. So we talked about three then, didn't we? So we said there were three sort of categories. You didn't use the word categories.
Yeah.
Three.
So that.
Yeah. Sorry.
Cues.
Yes, cues. Yeah, that's it. So high incidence group was one, and then we had language and behaviors were the other two. So where do you want to go next? Language? Yeah.
Yeah. So language. Imposters can involuntarily, I'd say, reveal themselves through just the type of remarks they make, the choice of their words, how they present certain ideas or suggestions. They might, for example, express their fear of incompetence, or their fear of not being able to do this challenge by using language like by comparing themselves, for example, to their peers and saying, oh, he's very clearly good at this, I will never be able to top this result, or I don't think I'm your best choice to lead this project, why don't you think of colleague XYZ, they have a lot more expertise in this area. Or you might catch them blowing up their own mistakes, or taking responsibility for mistakes that weren't even up to them. So all these kind of things, or hesitant phrasing is, for example, I'm very good at this, where it could be a potential red flag when you hear them say, not that I'm an expert by any means, but would you ever even consider, or, it's probably worthless, but it's just a thought. These kind of very hesitant phrasing when they come up with a proposal, because they're just not confident in their own ideas. Or they might deflect whenever you give them a compliment. That's always a good test, oh, that was very good of you, and if, oh, it's no big deal, I just got lucky, or it wasn't really because of me. So that's always a very good test to see whether these thoughts could be there or not. Just be very aware of language.
Okay. And then behaviors.
Yeah, and then behaviors. So behaviors, I quickly touched upon it already. There are a typical number of behavioral patterns that a lot of imposters do to avoid being discovered. I'd say it's either to avoid being discovered, or to make up, or to to compensate for what they think is their lack of intelligence or competence. Probably the most common one, and I've touched upon it, is holding back. So making themselves invisible. That was my speciality. So during a meeting, I would feel something coming up that I wasn't comfortable with, or I was sensing that somebody would ask me a question. I'd quickly go to the toilet, or I just wouldn't speak up, and they might even have a totally different opinion on a certain subject, but still follow or even mimic, the views of other people because they are afraid of being criticized or challenged. And one thing that is really a pity is that it's also a hamper to creativity, because they simply have no confidence in whatever would come out in a creative flow. So they're more likely to stick to the beaten track and not come up with alternative solutions or innovative ideas. So it's really a hamper on their performance in that way. They won't take on a challenge. They might not, go for a promotion. So it's just this making themselves as invisible as possible, which is a huge internal barrier to their progress and their success, but also to the business. So that's probably the biggest one. And another one is those that work extra hard, which are often then labeled as workaholics, because they want to compensate for their inabilities or for their shortcomings. And so they will overproduce, overprepare, make sure everything's always 100% ready. Actually, imposter phenomenon and perfectionism often go hand in hand. And so because they're so afraid to fail, they will over-deliver, work extra hard. And so there's an increased risk of, being physically exhausted or mentally exhausted, which can lead to depression and burnout, which is definitely something you'd want to avoid as a manager. So yeah, work extra hard, hold back. And I think then the last one I'd love to mention is procrastinate. So procrastination is a very useful tool for imposters if they want to avoid getting feedback, avoid being heard. They'll just wait until the last minute. It's also the perfect built-in excuse for any possible mistakes, because imagine if you'd work really, really long and hard on something, and you got and the result wasn't very good. That would be so much worse than if you'd just thrown something together last minute and I didn't have a lot of time, so I just did this last minute. And then if it's not perfect, it makes it a little bit less painful. So yeah, that would be the third one. But this is all relatively negative. So I just want to end with maybe one more positive one, that is a positive characteristic or behavior that is can be linked to imposters, which is they're often very good team workers. So they're the good colleague, because they don't necessarily want to stand out individually. They feel really safe working in a team. So they are recognized as having often better interpersonal skills, being very agreeable to work with. They're good listeners, conscientious, workers. They take on board feedback easily, even though inside it might eat them up. But they love to work towards common goals. So they are often very good team players, very good team workers. So that's definitely a positive one to highlight.
Okay. Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so we've got high incidence groups, the language that people might use and the behaviors they might display. So one of the things that's running through my head is, if I was a listener, it could be easy for me to hear what you've just described and go, all right, okay, so if I see somebody over preparing, or I see somebody procrastinating, or I see somebody who's a team worker, that means they have imposter phenomenon, which I don't think is what you're saying, is it?
No. So these are cues. These are just cues to maybe put them on the radar if several boxes check. But then that's where the work starts, and then from there you could, as a manager, try and talk to the person and see if indeed there are any of those feelings, and if indeed it is something they're struggling with.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I mentioned at the start of this episode that we wanted to make it really practical. So and maybe that's a really good link that you've given us then as we pull the podcast to a close, or this first episode anyway. In terms of so we talked about those three different areas: science, speech, language, and behaviors, and how they might be areas to look for, and if there's ticks in a few different areas, that might be a suggestion that potentially somebody might be experiencing imposter feelings, or might struggle with imposter phenomenon.
Exactly.
So what might be one tip then that you could give a manager to say, right, here's something you can do that would help?
Yeah. So in my scripts, I discuss about 10 practical methods or tips or tools, whatever you want to call it, for managers to use. But maybe just before I go into that, and to close this episode, maybe before we look at ways to manage people with imposter feelings, might be worth pointing out a natural, very well intended, but not always very useful reflex that managers have when they are interacting with employees that doubt themselves.
So like a what not to do, I suppose, then, in a way.
What not to do, or that's maybe a bit harsh, but because it's so well intended, but often people go into cheering mode. Yes, you can, and they go injecting lots of external energy and lots of positivity, and give out lots of compliments, and compliments are great, and by all means don't stop giving them, but be mindful of the shield. They probably will just say thank you, smile, and go thinking the exact same way as they were before. And the same goes for good advice. I don't know how many times I've heard, stop comparing yourselves to other people, start believing in yourself, and celebrate your successes. And it just goes right over my head, and it's also well intended. And I sometimes like to compare it with, when people are worrying and say, "Oh, don't worry, it's going to be all right." And I'm guilty of that. I've done it well as well, so it's not at all a criticism. But it probably won't stop them from worrying. So injecting all this energy and positivity and compliments is very nice, but it probably won't make much of a difference, and it's probably much more effective to talk with them about their imposter thoughts rather than addressing their imposter. And that's what we will talk about next time.
That sounds like a great place to wrap up this first episode, Hanne, and thank you so much for sharing your own experiences, as well as the wider research as well. And I feel like it would be beneficial, before the listener queues up episode 2, is to just take some time to think about all the different kind of ground that we've covered as we've worked our way through. So is there something that you would encourage the listener to do before we go on to episode 2?
I mean, what could be useful, what could be a nice challenge, or little task. I don't like the word, but it would be good for people to just have a think of who's walking around in the office, and who you think, based on all these check boxes, could potentially be struggling with these feelings. Might be good to just give that a thought. Do you see them? Yeah.
And would it be okay then if we put, say, a template or something in the show notes, or a link to a document in the show notes that somebody could download then, and be able to use that to, if they're looking at, if they're thinking of their team that they work with, whether that be virtually or in an office, that they've got some of those areas that we've discussed to look at. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Definitely. Yeah.
Wonderful.
But I also
okay. Please go. Yes.
So I'm in the process of writing this audiobook or whatever it will be, and so I'd welcome any feedback if people think you missed that or I don't agree with that. Any kind of feedback, but also if people have stories to share about how they've been managed successfully or unsuccessfully as an imposter, or the other way around, people that have had imposters in their team and how they've managed them and what's successful and what's not. That would be really helpful, and I would warmly like to invite them to reach out, to get in touch.
Absolutely, and we'll put your contact details in the show notes for people as well.
All right. Wonderful.
All right. In that case then, Hanne, thank you for sharing your thinking so far, and fair listener, we look forward to welcoming you back for episode 2.
You've been listening to the Emotion at Work podcast, and if you got this far, you must be interested in the role that emotions have in the workplace, either within individuals, between people in teams, or in organisations as a whole. So head over to the Emotion at Work hub, which you can find at community.emotionatwork.co.uk. Thanks for listening.